Hey everyone, welcome back to Here to Apologetics. So glad you joined us today. I have Kyle Alander of Christian Idealism and Ben Watkins of Real Life Theology. We're going to be discussing the argument from consciousness. So Kyle, Ben, thanks for joining me. How are you guys doing?
I'm doing good. I don't know, Ben. I think he's frozen.
I think Ben, unfortunately, as we were just talking off stream, and I think as soon as I pressed start recording, Ben froze and Ben's gone. So he'll reconnect in a minute. But we can do introductions, Kyle. So do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name's Kyle Alander. I run the Christian Idealism YouTube channel. My main focus is the philosophy of mind, although I do philosophy of religion as well. So I do both, but mainly philosophy of mind. Consciousness is definitely one of those topics that I love talking about. So this will be an interesting discussion with Ben.
That's great. And Ben, I'm glad you reconnected. And we're just doing if you have a brief introduction to say what you're all about.
Yes. Thank you for having me on. Sorry about the technical difficulties there. So my name's Ben Watkins. I'm a host of Real Theology, a philosophy of religion podcast, where we explore questions in the philosophy of religion from a non-theistic perspective. And so philosophy of mind kind of overlaps in the philosophy of religion. So the topic of consciousness is one that really interests me in my work in the philosophy of religion, but in a more broadly than that, I'm interested just in philosophy of mind. And so the mind-body problem is one of those questions that keeps me up at night. It's one of those things that I always think about, and I'm always really excited to continue reading more and more about discussions that have been had on the relation of how mind fits into the world.
Yeah, it's super exciting. And I think everyone who's joining us today, our format is we're going to have brief intros of about 10 minutes each. So Ben's going to go first and Kyle's going to follow. Then we're going to have about 50 minutes of just live discussion and then closing remarks. And then we'll have a little bit of Q&A at the end. But Ben, whenever you're ready, I know you have slides. You can put those, share the screen, and we'll pull that up and we'll get started.
Okay, let me share the screen. There we go.
Awesome. They should be pulled up. All right, I'll start. Whenever you start talking, Ben, I'll start the 10-minute timer.
Okay, so I want to discuss tonight the argument from consciousness and provide some objections. So I'll go ahead and admit at the start that I didn't really know what Kyle's position was tonight, or what form of the argument of consciousness he was going to be presenting. So I just put together a little presentation of how I understand the argument from consciousness and how I approach each of the three strategies. So the first strategy for an argument from consciousness I want to talk about is a likelihood. I want to discuss likelihood forms, Bayesian forms, and abductive, or what's called inference to the best explanation forms. And so the first is the modest likelihood formulation. And it argues that the general fact that there are conscious beings is more likely given theism than atheism. And the Bayesian format kind of ramps this up a bit. So the likelihood formulation doesn't tell us what to believe. It just tells us what direction we should believe, if that makes any conceptual sense. It tells us how we should update our beliefs given some observation. But Bayesianism wants to infer based on our total evidence. And so it uses what's called Bayes' theorem to try to calculate whether some hypothesis is more probable given some observation. And it does that with the Bayes factor, which is comprised of what we just saw, the likelihood functions, and prior probability. And so if the Bayes factor is greater than 1, and the prior probability is 1 or greater, then the left-hand side of this equation will be greater than 0.5. And so if it's greater than 0.5, we can truly claim in a strongly robust probable sense that theism is more probable because of that observation. And the third form of argument is an abductive form, and this is kind of a strange form in the sense that it's kind of it's a form looking for a theory. Like, is it what constitutes a best explanation? So is it the most likely explanation? Is it the most probable explanation? How do we cash this out? But I won't try to settle any of those questions tonight. And I'll just take an abductive version to be the idea that theism is probably the best explanation of facts, like the hard problem of consciousness. So first-person conscious experiences cannot be entirely characterized in physical terms. That's the hard problem of consciousness. And so if God created consciousness, then that would sufficiently explain the fact that conscious experiences cannot be entirely characterized in physical terms. And that explanation is better than any alternatives. Therefore, probably theism is true. So these are broadly the three forms that I have in mind when I try to characterize my objections to them tonight. So the first objection I want to raise to the argument from consciousness is an implication of what's known as the weak anthropic principle. So conscious experience, I want to argue, does not favor either theism or atheism. So it's false, the likelihood function, that the probability of observing consciousness is greater given theism than it is given atheism. I want to say that the weak anthropic principle states that we must be prepared to take into account the fact that our location in the universe is necessarily privileged to the extent of being compatible with our existence as conscious observers. So what does all of this mean? What it means is that when we try to go about collecting evidence for our observation, there is a fact that's induced by our existence as observers, an implication of the weak anthropic principle that biases what we will observe. So this is called an observation selection effect. So let me give an example of this from Arthur Eddington. So he describes a situation in which you're using a net to catch fish in a lake. And you notice an observation about all the fish you catch. You notice that they're all greater than 10 inches. And so you think, I wonder if all of the fish in this lake are greater than 10 inches, or if only half of them are. Well, that observation clearly favors the hypothesis that all of the fish in the lake are greater than 10 inches, because that's what you always observed. But then you notice a strange fact about your net. You notice that it has holes that are 10 inches large. So that means that fish that are smaller than 10 inches will be able to just swim right through. So you've learned a fact about how you've gathered your observation that biases what you will observe. The net that you use biases the size of the fish that you'll see. Well, something is similarly happening with consciousness. The fact that we are conscious observers. When we go out in the world to see if there is consciousness, we will always observe consciousness. The probability of observing consciousness, given the weak anthropic principle, is 1. And that's regardless of whether atheism or theism is true. So this undermines other design inferences as well. So, and it also undermines atheological design inferences. So, to give an example, the observation that the universe contains matter doesn't favor theism or atheism if that observation is made by observers who have material bodies. Similarly, the observation that the universe is orderly does not favor theism over atheism if the existence of the observers making this observation requires there to be order. And finally, the observation that certain cosmic values are right for life does not favor theism over atheism if this observation is made by observers that are themselves alive. So the weak anthropic principle and the fact that we exist as observers induces observation selection effects that undermine several forms of design inferences. So that was the first objection. The second objection I want to lay out is the argument from physical minds. And I want to kind of turn the tables and say that, no, there are particular observations about conscious experience that are more probable given atheism than theism. So if we want to avoid the observation selection effect that is induced by our existence, we need to look at more particular facts about consciousness that are not implied by the weak anthropic principle. But when we turn our attention to these more particular facts, I'll argue that those facts favor atheism rather than theism. The first observation is that all observed mental properties like consciousness, personality, and other psychological traits are correlated with physical changes in embodied brains. The second observation is that minds and their psychological traits are physically related, such that the probability of a mind having certain psychological traits is determined by genetics. And the third observation is that the complexity of mental capacities in any animal species is correlated with the complexity of their brain states. So now I can create likelihood functions of my own and say that these observations are more likely given atheism than they are given theism. So if we understand the inference to the best explanation as the inference to the most likely hypothesis, then I think I can make a really strong argument from physical minds here. So to give the first observation, although mental activity is correlated with a physical change in embodied brains, when we damage a brain, we can impair mental functioning and psychological capacities like personality, memory, or the capacity to have any conscious experiences at all. But why does this physical damage to a brain have any effect on mental functioning? So these are the kinds of ways that I want to defend the idea that the best explanation for these particular facts is that they are physically dependent facts. So the third objection attacks the Bayes formation of this argument. And I want to say that atheism is simpler than theism because it has a higher intrinsic probability. And so I'm arguing here that supernaturalism is not intrinsically more probable than naturalism. Theism is intrinsically less probable than supernaturalism. Naturalism is intrinsically less probable than atheism. Therefore, it follows atheism is intrinsically more probable than theism. The fourth objection that I want to lay out is that the best explanation is not remote. Is that, yep. So
you cut out there, Ben. I don't know if like your internet was being
neutral monism. That
yeah,
because Newton is the best. Yep.
We lost you there for a minute, Ben. So we missed you right when you went to like the neutral monism thing. So we're at 10 minutes. Maybe you want to just like briefly bring this up, and then we can go to Kyle's opening.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and end it right there because I think I've put the objections that I want to mention at least on the table. The only other slides that I had remaining were like kind of recapped what I just said. But it was basically those four.
Yeah, I was thinking we can go over those in our discussion if you want, but same thing with my presentation. But
for sure.
Yeah, because awesome. The neutral monism stuff. Yeah, but the neutral monism stuff, we can discuss that after. Okay, so now I'm going to present my presentation. Hold on, let's see here. Share screen. All right, let's see here. Hopefully this will be right. Okay, you guys see that?
Yeah, I just pulled it up.
Okay, excellent, excellent. All right, I'm going to do a full screen. Okay, that's good. Okay. So does consciousness point to theism? Well, I'm going to present near the end of this presentation what I call the argument from a mental world or idealism, because that's my sort of view on the relation to consciousness. So obviously before we get to does consciousness point to theism, we first have to actually define consciousness, right? So consciousness is mental activity in itself. Mental activity is conscious if and only if there is anything it is like to have such mental activity in itself. Another definition we could put forth would be this. Mental activity is conscious if there is something it feels like to have such mental activity in itself. I don't like the words to use to feel, however, so philosophers of mind typically just define consciousness as anything it is like to have mental activity of itself. And so this is from philosophers such as David Chalmers and Thomas Nagel and those sort of guys. I think Ben would actually agree with this definition, so I don't want to go too much into it because there's other things I want to sort of get into. But yeah, this is just defining consciousness, what it is, so that we can sort of understand and grasp it. So the theory I hold to, which is idealism, basically says that the fundamental nature of reality is consciousness. So experience ontologically is mental in type. And so matter, what we call matter, is comprised of phenomenal states or contents of consciousness. And so matter would also be, mental in type as well. So the first thing we need to really do is to compare the theories of consciousness, right? So when investigating whether consciousness points to theism, it's important that we recognize the theories, right? So this can be physicalism, dualism, panpsychism, or cosmopsychism, neutral monism, and then, of course, idealism. And then the two general just criteria we want to use is, of course, simplicity. If everything is equal, we should prefer the simpler theory, except the theory which postulates the fewest number of unnecessary assumptions or less complex primitive entities. And then, of course, the explanatory power, where we want a theory that explains the most with the least, the one that can sort of unify and explain things where there's not as much bruteness involved and there's less explanatory gaps involved as well. So on simplicity, of course, I would say that idealism is simple. The idealist needs only one kind of basic entity, an experiencing mind or some experiencing minds. So all that exists is experience simpliciter. Now, I'll get more into the idealist view of matter in a moment, but I just want to point that out there. And of course, I would say that monism is also very simple, right? Because it only has one kind of entity which grounds all of reality. I guess a view that I hold, just to clarify, is a sort of dual aspect monism, where there's one irreducible substance that is termed in both physical and mental ways. Again, I'll get more into this in the discussion, but I guess you can sort of view it as like two sides of the same sort of coin. And so it's seen that idealism is a type of monism. It would bypass, certain problems like the interaction problem and the pairing problem, and all this. There's no hard problem either. So that's another advantage to this sort of view. Now, there's other considerations to take into account. So this is just a comparison of the two views. So on physicalism, all mental changes has a sufficient physical cause. And of course, there are no mental differences without a physical difference. And in mind necessarily supervenes on this physical. Now, I also want to point out here that there's another thing that's important here, where you have non-foundational minds, and all non-foundational physical things depend on a foundational physical substance, or some sort of like necessary substance. So both views are going to have to posit contingency and necessities in their ontology, right? And then on idealism, it's the same sort of thing, where all mental or private minds change has a sufficient transpersonal mental cause. I'll get more into this in the discussion, but you can basically think of a transpersonal mental cause as any mental cause that is outside our own private minds, right? So there's still a distinction between our private minds and the external world. Again, we'll get more into that discussion to help clarify, but I just want to point that out, that it seems like right here, because both views have contingency and necessities, then they're both going to be symmetric, right? So neither view is actually going to be more complex than the other. Now, there is a symmetry breaker, which I will point out, and this has to do with what the issue of what matter is, right? So I call this problem, and this is sort of a new issue in the philosophy of mind, is basically the problem of positive properties. So when we say an object is physical, there is no way in which we can describe it where we refer it to as an object without reference to mental experiences or properties. A non-idealist needs to show there are qualities in non-mental or physical properties or objects that are intrinsic to the objects themselves. We can say that there is nothing more to such physical items than a world of mental properties. And so there's no need to posit this physical substance that is beyond the mental experiences. All things physical seem to just be positive properties of mental experiences. And so on idealism, I guess just want to point out here that our experience of the world is simply just what the world is, because the world is experience. The colors, sounds, smells you're experiencing right now is the real reality, or the actual world, right? So the implication is, if that's the case, then all of reality is in consciousness, but reality will be made of the qualities of experience, right? And so I guess the final point here is just that matter is an abstraction of mind, which means that the existence of matter, or any world outside consciousness, is not an empirical fact, but it's just like an extra assumption in the explanatory model of any sort of non-idealist position. And so when we apply Occam's razor, and since idealism doesn't seem to require this extra assumption, then idealism has a simpler ontological explanatory model than the alternatives, right? So that's the symmetry breaker there. Now, this is a sort of quote. This is to sort of highlight this sort of problem. Quote, the defined characteristic of explanation by abstraction is a progressive movement away from Edmund Husserl's life world and the concreteness of direct experience. First, one posits a world devoid of qualities, and as such devoid of concreteness too, for concreteness is a quality of experience. Then one progressively loads this world of properties that entail no direct isomorphism to experience. So we have the mind, which represents our mind. Then we have the material world, which represents like our perceptions of it, like what we directly experience. But then if you're not an idealist, you have to posit this extra world that is somehow beyond experience itself, and that I think that's a theoretical cost there. Now, I also want to point out an issue with arbitrary limits. So in our theory of consciousness, we want to make sure we are not positing fundamental limits to the nature of reality. And so we can sort all theories of reality into two categories. Either the theory entails the simplest foundation or entails some additional complexity. So I would say that by the tool of simplicity, the theory with no arbitrary limits is simpler because it has no bruteness and therefore more probable. The simplest account of the foundation explains the most complexity, since then all complexity is then explained by a simple root, which is something with no arbitrary limits. And finally, the uniformity dependence, which is that every complex array of limits, everything that's limited, depends on something else, right? And so if the foundation has no limits, then it doesn't really need an explanation in that sense, right? And a simple, non-arbitrary, non-limited foundation could be the ultimate foundation of everything, including all the material complexities of our universe and its limits. So I guess my point here is that when comparing theories, we want to make sure that we're not positing fundamental limits to the foundation of reality. And this will become relevant to, I guess, my final slide here, which is the argument, my argument from consciousness. So there's two stages. So this first stage argues just for idealism. The second stage goes from idealism to sort of theism. So stage one and premise one, I'm sure Ben would agree with this. The causal close of the universe, which is every event which has a cause of an event which is the same in type. Premise two, the irreducibility of consciousness, which is that the mental is subjective and quantitative in type and cannot be reduced to or identified as an objective and quantitative phenomena. And then finally, premise three, which is just mental causation, where mental events can cause physical events. And so the conclusion for all this, when you combine causal closure with the irreducibility of consciousness, and then that consciousness can actually have causal powers, you get a sort of idealism where because everything's causally closed, and because the only thing that could really exist in such a world would be the mental, right? And it's because mental things have causal powers, then it would seem like the only thing that really exists is the mental world. And so anything in the universe would just be mental, right? So that's stage one of the argument. And in stage two of the argument is just sort of identifying, okay, what's the best theory of idealism, right? So if everything is mental, if idealism is true, then reality is constructed by a mental foundation. So I just want to point out here that premise four just is talking more broadly. So this is compatible with any version of idealism, even like non-theistic forms. So the foundation can either be a singular mind or it could be a plurality of minds, right? Depending on which version you hold to. Now, premise five, that might be the most controversial premise might be premise five, which is that the simplest version of idealism is one in which the mental foundation lacks fundamental arbitrary limits. And then I would argue that the simplest version of idealism is one where there's only one mind that guides everything, and this mind has no arbitrary limits. And so therefore, the simplest and most parsimonious version of idealism is one in which the mental foundation is a singular, unlimited mind. And so I guess categorizing this argument, I'd probably put it in the abductive camp. So obviously, it's not a Bayesian argument. It's not a likelihood argument. It's more of an abductive argument. So if I had to categorize it, that's what I would put it in. But this is my argument. I appreciate it if Ben would give me his thoughts on this, and we can discuss this more in the discussion. So anyways, that'll be the end of my presentation now. Hold on. Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Kyle and Ben. Appreciate you guys making slides and not acting, but looking so smart with your slides. So what we'll do now is we have a live discussion. So we have a live discussion for about 50 minutes. So it's really up to you guys, wherever you want to take it. So I'll pop myself off the screen here and I'll come in if need be, but I'm sure you guys aren't going to be like insulting each other or anything. So yeah, if we'll go for about 50 minutes, I'll come in and then we'll go to closing remarks and Q&A. So leave it to you guys.
Cool. All right. So yeah, it's interesting that you brought. Okay, you want to go first, or I'll just let you go first, and then
yeah. Well, so, because I'm just characterizing questions at this point. Because it seems like I see two deep disagreements here. And so one I think we can resolve, and the other I don't think we'll be able to resolve. So
Okay.
I'll start with the one that I think we'll be able to resolve, and that's the solution to the mind-body problem. So first, I want to know how you characterize the mind-body problem, because it sounds like we're both just neutral monists, and you call yourself an idealist, and I sometimes call myself a physicalist. But at the end of the day, we're both monists, and we just cash that out. So I think this is a disagreement. Like, granted, this is a super big disagreement to resolve our disagreements on. If we have the same answer to the mind-body problem, but cash it out into different terms, that's awesome. That's a win.
Yep.
So I want to start there. The second, disagreement that I don't think we'll be able to resolve is that theism implies some form of dualism. That monism is just not going to be compatible with the kind of theism that most theists would find attractive, like perfect being theists. So if we're going to depart from that,
I think we could. I actually think we could solve both problems, but we'll I guess we can discuss. So maybe I'm more optimistic.
I put my chin out there, so by all means, knock me out on both.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so first I wanted to see how you characterize the mind-body problem, and I want to see, kind of your solution to it.
Okay, so I think the mind-body problem is, obviously, I think you would agree with me, which is a pseudo problem, where basically it's a problem that's sort of a consequence of the way we did metaphysics, right? So how I typically like to look at it is you go back to René Descartes, right? And he's not him specifically, but he was the main influencer of making this hard distinction between mind and matter, right? And that's where you get the problems within modern philosophy, which is, well, if mind and matter are two fundamentally different substances, then how can they interact, right? And that's typically the objection that you'll get to, like, a sort of substance dualism, right? I think my solution is just don't be a substance dualist, right? Be a monist, right? Just say basically that you have to. So there's two things you have to do. Number one, you have to sort of understand what consciousness is. And then number two, I think a way to solve it is to understand what is the nature of the external world. Like, what is matter actually made of? Like, what is matter fundamentally, right? If we can, so in my view, obviously, because I'm an idealist, the way I cash out the problem is, okay, we've made this hard distinction between the external world that's somehow beyond experience and then our eternal world, which is experience. So my solution is just, okay, let's just get rid of the non-experiential world, and we just say everything is somehow termed in experiential terms or mental terms, I would say, right? It could be compatible with neutral monism. It just depends on what you mean by neutral monism. So there are objections that I have to neutral monism, but those objections only apply if you make neutral monism as a competitor to idealism. So you have to basically preclude idealism in that sense. But that's how I solve the problem, where basically I just I just talk about the whole world, like both our mental experiences and the world out there is just all just one category of things, or two sides of the same coin, essentially. I don't know, what's your perspective on the mind-body problem?
Okay, so do we? I feel like that the mind-body problem was the first bit, but I feel like you were also focusing on the second objection of that theism kind of implies this dualism. So I want to say something about both. So the idea that theism implies substance dualism, I don't think we have to look particularly to Descartes for this idea, this radical distinction between mind and body. I certainly agree with you. I don't know if I'd say it's a pseudo problem. I would say that it's a real problem that needs solving. But it's a pseudo problem, I think, in the sense you mean, in the sense that, look, it's because we have these two traditions. And because the effects of these two traditions are that they gave rise to this problem. And so if we just do away with the mistakes of those two traditions, there is no problem. And so that's what I think you mean by a pseudo tradition. And I
that's
totally,
what. Yeah.
So totally on the same page with you there. But the idea that drives the intuition pump for the idea that theism implies substance dualism is that the idea that God is a supreme mind on his own. If we just say there's God and nothing else, God is a mind. But then God creates a world separate from himself. So the idea that drives is that there's God, and then there's the world he creates. And these are distinct from one another. And that when we combine the two of them, that either we have implausible implications or we end up in some sort of pantheism that is just seems more closer to atheism than it seems to theism. And so what do I mean by that? I have to cash out these claims. And so I think the defensible version of idealism for theism is what Bishop Berkeley famously put forward, the idea that we are the contents of God's mind. And so the idea that the physical world as we perceive it is in some sense illusory. And so if a tree fell in the woods and there was no God, then no one would hear it because there would be nothing there to perceive. And so it's God's, the mental perceptions in God's actual mind that sustain the world at any given moment. And that there's a very real sense in which the material world is illusory. And so I find that implausible. I realize idealists just disagree with me, and that the strength of their arguments comes on pushing back against that intuition. I want to say that there is this real physical world, and by physical world, what I mean is that there's this world that's describable in third-person terms that does not require anything about our first-person subjective experience in order to be true. So the contents of science, the contents of physics are describing something real, a real feature of reality that is not dependent on a first-person quality, something that we would associate with a mind. And so I take it for granted that there is a physical world, that physics describes something objective, and that by being objective, it doesn't depend on anything subjective. And so that's why even though I consider myself a neutral monist, I would consider myself a physicalist or a non-reductive physicalist or a non-reductive monist, because I want to say that there are these features of reality that we describe in physical terms. And by physical terms, I mean third-person terms that are true, independent of any first-person subjective experience. We don't need to know what it's like to be a bat to know the laws of motion or to know, Einstein's theory of relativity. We're saying something true about a world that is entirely independent of conscious experience. And so that's why I'm a neutral monist, because I think that there's two ways of describing the same one world. And there's only one world, but one coin, but there's two sides of the coin, and you can't capture the entire coin unless you describe both sides of the coin. And when I'm looking at one side of the coin, I can't see the other side of the coin. If I want to see the other side of the coin, I have to turn it around such that I can't see the side that I was just looking at. And so there's just like when I'm talking in mental terms, I can't just also talk in physical terms. That would be like looking at both sides of the coin at the same time. And when I talk in mental terms, I can't just, or when I talk in physical terms, I can't just talk in mental terms. Again, it would just be like trying to look at two sides of the same coin at this. You can't do it. But why I lean to call myself a physicalist is because I think that there just are these features of reality that are independent of our conscious experience, and that conscious experience, as we understand it in the philosophy of mind, is something radically emergent from this neutral substance. Now, I'll go ahead and admit at the beginning that I'm going to confuse some people, because though I'm not an idealist in the philosophy of mind, I am an idealist in epistemology. I'm a Hegelian. What do I mean by that? God, why would I use these terms? I know I wasn't here when the terms came along. I'm really sorry. But an idealist in epistemology is the idea that the world is rational all the way through, so that there's this kind of identity between knowing and being, so that they're two sides of the same coin. And so we get the terms idealist from the German idealist tradition. So if you were to say, oh, I'm an idealist in the philosophy of mind, and someone was like, well, what's your view? And you were like, I'm a transcendental idealist. You'd be like, no, dude, you're thinking about Kant in epistemology. It's just a different way of using the term idealist. I know it sucks. Yeah. But in that German idealist tradition, I'm what's known as an absolute idealist. So Kyle mentioned earlier in his opening, this idea of having to posit this extra mental, like, how do we know about this? That's Kant. That's the problem that plagues Kant's famous transcendental idealism. How do we understand these things in themselves? If there's, we're relegated to the world of noumena, but there's a world of phenomena. How does the world of noumena get into the world of phenomena? Absolute idealism tries to resolve those issues. So again, I think the first issue we can resolve. We're both neutral monists in the strict sense of philosophy of mind. The second objection, I'm not so confident we'll be able to resolve our disagreement here, because I'm going to want to, as putting on my theist cap, I'm going to want to preserve the intuition that God created a world separate from himself, something that's distinct. They're not the same thing. Mm-hmm. I think that, but now you take a not so popular route. So I'm super excited to hear why this disagreement exists. Why is it that you part ways with someone like William Lane Craig or Richard Swinburne or Alvin Plantinga, when they really, these theistic thinkers obviously think there's a lot riding on substance dualism being false.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing is, I think there's two things. Number one is, of course, the model of God that I hold to. And then number two is this distinction between what we call necessities and contingencies. So to resolve the disagreement, I guess, would be that every view, whether or not you're a theist or a naturalist, you're going to have to posit both the contingent and the necessary. Otherwise, either you have to say everything's contingent, which I think that's a theoretical cost, or you say everything is necessary, and that's another theoretical cost in the other end, right? So I guess my first question to you is, do you think that there is a distinction between something that's contingent and something that has necessary existence?
Well, I think that's a great question. So that's a modal distinction. And so I want to, in traditional philosophy fashion, say I don't know, that I haven't thought about that question enough. But if the chips are down, if I'm making arguments and I'm thinking about it, I do think that contingency and necessity are valid distinctions. That our modal distinctions refer to truths in the world. So if I say that, if I make some claim that it could have been the case that X, Y, and Z happened, I think it's true that it could have been the case that something happened. Or if I said that something could not have failed to be the case, it was necessary, I think that that's true. I know that there are arguments against this kind of modal realism. And so that's why I preface by saying I don't know. I'm not too familiar with those arguments, but I would just insist that these modal distinctions are real. And I think that that's common ground that all parties to the discussion can concede. Even if at the end of the day they're modal anti-realists, certainly the language helps us get at the truth better. They get us closer to the truth. They're at least useful in that sense.
Okay. Zach, can I give me like 1 second? I gotta let my cat out. Is that okay?
Yeah, you're good. I can destroy Ben while you're gone.
Okay.
So no,
There
I'm
you
just
go.
kidding.
I have
Do you have
5
anything you want
cats, so I totally know this struggle. Like, this struggle is very real. Like, when a cat wants to get out, they will get out. When a cat wants to be let in, it can get even worse.
All right, I'm back.
That's funny. All right. Well, good cat talk, Ben. I'm gonna.
Okay. Okay. So yeah, I think when we make that distinction, I think that can show you that, okay, well, obviously there has to be a distinction between the foundation of reality and whatever it produces, right? It may not be an ontological distinction, right? But there still has to be some sort of distinction. I guess another thing I should point out here is that and this goes to my second point, which is, I can't remember, but anyways, my model of God. Okay, so I reject the doctrine of creation ex nihilo. Okay, which basically means that I think when God creates the world, it's basically through God's own mental contents, right? It's not like God just created something out of nothing. I don't even think that's a coherent concept, right? So whatever God creates is going to be still ontologically relevant to God's nature, right? It doesn't mean that therefore we share in the essence of God, right? Because we're not necessary. We're still contingent beings, but we are still going to share some ontology to God in the sense of the fact that we're mental beings, right? So when God creates the world, it's not like God created this whole material, universe that's outside of, this Cartesian category we call matter, right? Rather, God created the world through his own mentation, right? Sort of, I guess one analogy, I don't really like this analogy, but one analogy you could use is we live in a simulation, or probably a better analogy would be that we live in the mind of God, or we live in God's dream, right? That's that sort of idea, right? So while it's true that God did create a public environment, right, as Swinburne would say, because I know he presents like an argument for why we would need
Swinburne's
bodies.
a dualist.
Well, I know, but
I know, I'm messing with you. I
but-
couldn't help myself.
but yeah, but the cool thing about Swinburne is I think his argument could equally apply to idealism, because all that's required for his arguments to work is that God creates a public environment. That's compatible with an idealist position, right? So I don't have to, as an idealist, I don't have to posit that God created this material substance that's, beyond consciousness or whatever. I could just say, well, the material, the stuff that God made is itself mental, right? These mental properties, right? And that we experience every day. So that's why I would say, because of those reasons, I don't think that theism, at least my model of theism, does not imply substance dualism. Now, there are other models that may imply it. I grant you that point, right? Especially, so if you think that God created the world out of nothing, that might imply it. I'm open to that possibility. But I think my sort of model of God isn't going to really imply substance dualism, right? So that's, I don't know. I know, hopefully we can resolve that disagreement. I don't know, but
So
we'll see how it goes.
I mentioned Swinburne is a dualist. So there is a Christian idealist tradition. So I don't want to pretend like this tradition just doesn't exist. Who should we be reading in that tradition? Who is your favorite Christian idealist to turn to? I'm putting you on the spot. You've got probably 5 seconds to answer.
The only one I can think of would be Keith Ward, although he has some weird views on the resurrection that I don't agree with. But yeah, I do admit that.
That's what I was thinking of. So the fact that you said that, I was like, all right, we're on the same page. So the other intuition I'm putting on my theist hat here, because you want to say that theism doesn't imply a kind of form of substance dualism, and that matter is just a different aspect of God. Or so, are you saying God is the neutral substance?
I would say that God, if you're talking neutral substance, yeah. So if you're saying that neutral substance is the ground for reality, well then yeah, God is the ground for reality. So yeah.
No, that's fair enough. That's fair enough.
Yep.
So because I think that in the theistic tradition, and I find this plausible is God created the world separate from himself. We've already mentioned that. But also the idea that God is not physical. God is not material. God is not made of anything.
Right.
And so that intuition is certainly threatened by something like an idealist view, because that's going to want to say no, or just any monist view in general is no, God is material in one sense. He might only be partially material, or matter might only be one aspect of God's essence, but God is in a sense matter. And so again, I think that this is a strong theistic intuition, is that there was once a time when God existed and there was no other creation. It was just God. And God was pure mind. But then he did something and created something. And that something that he did, that act of creation, created something unique, something that did not exist before. And so that's a hard demarcation. There's just that once you have that act of creation, boom, you've got something distinct from God. And so there's just no way out of this substance dualism, because like you said, we want to preserve that God's mind is in some way analogous to ours. He created this different world, but we're like God in the mental part of it, but we're entirely unlike God in our material way of it. And so that when we die a material death, but we survive mentally. And so that you just don't have that distinction on idealism.
So, okay, so I guess I should clarify. Well, okay, two things. Number one would be what the body actually is, what the body represents. So I would say the body is itself the appearance of our mind, right? Kind of like the avatar. I don't really like those analogies, but that's like the best way I can do it. Another point this is my second point, which is the distinction between what's called something that's geometric and something that's not geometric, right? Now, why is this important? Well, all matter, as we know, is geometric in some sense, right? Now, I think that God is not geometric at all, right? I think that whatever the ground of reality is, I think it's non-geometric. In fact, I sort of take the view that all of geometry itself is dependent, has a contingent nature, and it's contingent upon something that's non-geometric. So if you take that sort of distinction, well, you could say that, well, yeah, while it's true that God created a geometric world, right? That geometric world still, that's like kind of like the, how should I put it? So basically, the world is itself the geometric representation of God's thoughts, but God himself is not geometric, right? God can reveal himself as geometric, like he can come down as a human, but the actual essence of God is not geometric, right? Because all geometry is ultimately dependent upon a non-geometric foundation, right? And this is something that Joshua Rasmussen brought up in his debate book with Philip Leon, and Philip actually agreed to the argument.
Great book, good plug.
Yeah. So that's sort of my view, where I think, obviously, I agree with you that there are important distinctions between God and the world, right? But I don't think that the distinction have to be so, distinct that you're having to create separate ontological categories, right? I think it could still be one ontological category. It could still be one, reality that's all mental, right? This sort of monism, but you can still make distinctions within that monism. So you could still make a distinction.
So I want to press on this point. I think this is where our disagreement really lays. I think this is where the disagreement between is very deep and potentially irresolvable. So I want to ask right now, do you think that there is an ontological distinction between being alive and being dead?
I would say no.
So because that's my answer. So I'm a monist as well.
Okay.
So I would say there is no
Okay.
ontological distinction.
I was just making sure it wasn't like a trick question. I was like, oh, I got to think
No,
about it.
no,
Probably
no,
not.
no, no,
Yeah.
no. Those
Okay.
are the worst kind. Those are the worst questions. Being
Okay,
technically
yeah.
right is the best kind of right, and trick questions are the worst questions. So,
Okay.
I don't think there is an ontological distinction between it. But I think that comes with an implication. I think there's a cost to that. Remember how you were saying earlier, like there was, things about simplicity, there was factors about contingency and necessity, and that when you go into one of those camps, like someone have theoretical costs. And so I think a theoretical cost here by this move. Can you hear me? I know it just kind of cut out for a second.
You broke up a little bit. Yeah, you're fine now, but it was breaking up a little bit. So
okay, yeah, okay, fair enough. So,
okay, yeah.
If there is no ontological distinction between life and death, I don't think we can make any sense of the idea of surviving death. So this idea that we can continue on past it, I think that's a huge worry. One of the big questions in the philosophy of religion is, do we survive our deaths? Well, if we take this monist position in the philosophy of mind, I think that has a cost, and I think that cost is that no, we do not survive our deaths. There is no ontological distinction between being alive and being dead.
That is interesting, because okay, so I guess I should clarify. So when I think what happens when we die is that our consciousness is still there, but our basically our personalities, our egos and stuff, that goes away, basically. It's called ego death, right? You can experience this if you take psychedelic drugs, right? People will start to lose the sense of their self. Now, do you lose consciousness? No, right? Because as an idealist, I think that's all that really exists is consciousness, right? So consciousness doesn't go away. But what can go away is your ego, your personality, your sense of self, right? So in that sense, then yeah, if you're talking about ego death, well then no, our ego basically goes away when we die, right? Now, is it the idea that we're going to stop experiencing? No, I think we're going to continue to experience things. However, again, your ego, like you as a person, you as an individual self, is not going to be around any longer when you die, right? So that's sort of my view, and I think it's pretty consistent with this idea that, okay, well, do we survive our deaths? Well, it depends, right? If you're talking about consciousness, well, then yeah, consciousness survives death. But if we're talking about the ego, then no, it doesn't, right? So there is that distinction, that important distinction you have to make. So yeah, I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? I guess I don't want to get too sidetracked from, but
no. This is great because I think this is like, even if our disagreement is irresolvable, we've identified it, and this is where we can have deep, productive discussion about these disagreements. So this it's win-win, I promise. So I would want to say that we just can't have our cake and eat it too here, because we're all right there. We made the distinction that, like, no, there's no ontological distinction between life and death, and there's no ontological distinction between God and the world. It's all just one big, monist picture. And so I think that once we broaden our, we see that those distinctions have been completely lost. And so we're saying we can draw the distinction. There's no ontological distinction between us being alive and us being dead. Is there an ontological distinction between us being God and not being God? Again, like God created a world separate from himself. He created individuals that are not him. They are ontologically distinct. But on this monist view, no, we are God in a very real sense. It's all the same, regardless of the ontology.
Yeah.
And so it's just, to me, that seems like it's a hard sell. For me as an atheist, I'm not a theist, Like, I can only imagine how perfect
Mm.
being theists or Christian theists are here and go, and they're like, I don't know how, I just don't know how to make sense of it.
No, yeah. Well, there is a important distinction within Orthodox Christianity, which is the essence energy distinction. So I would say that we are part of God and His energies, right? In fact, that's the whole point. I think one of the big things with Christian theism
I'm
is
sorry to interrupt. So when you say energies, I know this is super rude to interrupt you like this, but when you
no,
say
it's good.
energies, just so that we're clear, like what are you saying? Like actual like physical energy measured in joules. Like, what do you mean by energies? Because that's you know what I mean? Like, what do we mean by that? Like, we are God's energies. I feel like that we got to unpack that claim.
No, yeah, that's a good point. So basically, the energies of God is basically the creative power of God, right? So think of it, I guess one analogy you could sort of think of this where you have the sun, which represents the essence, and then the rays represents the energies, right? Now, there is still a distinction between the sun and the energy. So I do think that like God has spontaneous effects. So when God creates the world, it's more spontaneous, it's more indeterministic, as we could say. And if it's indeterministic, then that would make God basically create the world a contingent world. So whatever God creates is not going to be necessary that world exists, right? There's still contingency involved, right? So we're a part of God in that sense. We're a part of God's creative process. We're part of God's, basically God creates like a mental environment through there, right? So everything's still mental. So it's not like God is creating this substance that's beyond mentation, right? Because all that God is required to do is God only needs to create a world of experience, right? So if God only needs to create a world of experience, only needs to create some sort of public environment, well, I would say, well, why does God, God doesn't need to create a whole material universe, that's independent of experience or independent of consciousness in that sense. So that's what I would say. But yeah.
So for your view, does something like a modal collapse worry you? And I know I'm kind of throwing this. This is my curveball for the debate. So the idea behind a modal collapse is that God is necessary, and so that if God is necessary, He's devoid of any contingencies. If He's devoid of contingency, then He couldn't have done otherwise, and if He couldn't have done otherwise, then He's not perfectly free.
Yeah.
That's the idea of a modal collapse. And so like this is another cost of a monist view, that it just rules out a divine libertarian free will. Is that an objection that worries you?
I think it does, but only if, okay, so I guess I should also clarify. There are different views of monism, right? So you have existence monism, which says that, well, there's only one fundamental object in the world, and like all these different distinctions within nature are just illusions, right? Or you can hold the, which is what I hold to, which is the priority monism view, where ultimately everything comes from one source of nature, right? And so I hold to the priority monistic view, where yes, monism is true in the sense like everything is ultimately made of the same kind of stuff, which is the mental, but there's still a distinction between the initial mental item, which is God and, the necessary nature, versus the contingency. So I would say that as creatures, we are part of the contingency. So whatever God creates, we are part of that, right? We're part of the creative process, right? But again, there's still one substance in reality, but there's still a distinction between the priority thing, which is God, versus everything else that sort of breaks up from God. So that's what I would hold to. It's a little different because it avoids modal collapse, right? Because there's still indeterminacy and stuff. So God is not determined to create a world, because if He was, then that would, involve necessitarianism, which I want to avoid that at all costs. Yeah, go ahead.
This is a bit of an unfair question, but
no, it's fine.
Indeterminacy and free will. So we're appealing to indeterminacy here, but I understand indeterminacy as randomness. do you have a positive view of what's often called libertarian free will here, in which we can this single substance can kind of rise above itself in the
Yeah.
sense of being able to freely determine actions that are not constrained by laws within this neutral
Well,
world.
that's an excellent question.
It's a rabbit hole of a question. I know
Hey,
it's a bit unfair.
No, it's okay. It's okay.
Couldn't help
So
myself.
so my view, some people would consider me to be a compatibilist. I wouldn't go that far, but I do lean towards that view. So basically, I hold to what's called the soft libertarian free will, right? Where yes, you have free will, but it's more constrained than what most people like to think, right? For example, I could never freely choose to murder babies, right? It's just not going to happen, right? Because I have a certain moral nature that's going to determine.
As a matter of psychological fact, it's just it's just not of the ways in which it is true to say that it's possible you could act in this way. One of those ways just isn't murdering, torturing baby. I feel like we're on the same page here. I feel like we've established some common ground. So at the end of the day, we can at least say that.
Yep. Good. All right. So yeah, that's my view. Basically, a sort of soft libertarian free will, and again, that applies to all. That doesn't just apply to humans, but that also applies to God as well, right? So I could sort of use that to sort of explain, God's choices and stuff, intentions, and so. But yeah, is there anything? Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Let's talk hard problem of consciousness. So I've thrown some. I would consider them a few unfair questions at you, just because libertarian free will is a huge rabbit hole. So I'll throw I'll softball an objection my way. That's equally a rabbit hole, and that's the hard problem of consciousness. So I think that you believe that your view of idealism and the conjunction of your idealism and theism gives an advantage in the hard problem of consciousness. So first off, how do you understand the hard problem of consciousness? And how do you think that your view gives us an advantage in the hard problem of consciousness? So I feel like I can softball that to you, and that's because I have my view obviously gives rise to a hard problem, and it's hard.
Yeah. So the hard problem is basically it's an argument against reductionism. Basically says that you have these two different things. You have the mental first, which you describe in first person terms, and then you have third person terms. And the point is that you cannot reduce your first person terms to the third person terms, or you can't take something that's qualitative, which is our experience of the world, like taste, colors, and sounds, and then reduce into something that's not qualitative, right? You can't take something that's qualitative and then reduce it to something that's quantitative, right? You can't take something that's described in first person terms and then completely described in third person. It just doesn't work, right? So that's the way. That's how I see the hard problem. And then the way I solve that hard problem is just to deny that consciousness is reducible. I just say, well, consciousness is itself irreducible, right? You cannot. The point is, you cannot reduce consciousness to third person terms. So that's how I solve the hard problem. Basically, I just deny the reducibility of consciousness.
So I think the parallel problem for your view. So I have a hard problem of consciousness to solve, but your view has a hard problem of matter to resolve. So it's like what I was mentioning before, and again, this is the uphill climb that I have to make. I have to argue for this. Is that matter seems to be a real feature of the world that doesn't depend on our subjective first-person experience. So if we are to believe the story given to us by historians of science, the methods of science since Galileo have, stripped away the first person experiences from our understandings of the natural world. And so it's that very process of doing that has allowed us to make as much progress as we have scientifically since the Enlightenment. And so if we're to believe that there is just that the idea that there is a material world just is a datum, and that there is a problem of the external world in epistemology, but there just is a solution to it. Like solipsism just isn't the answer to that.
Yeah.
Like it's one of those datums that like there just is a material world. And so while like my view gives rise to a, there just is a hard problem of consciousness. We just can't deny, the existence of consciousness. I think there's also a parallel problem on the other side here. We just can't deny the existence of a material world. There just is a physical world, and that physical world doesn't depend on any mental facts. Mental facts might underlay them. They might go all the way down to atoms, like panpsychists argue. But the idea is that no, there is this physical reality that just does not depend on anything mental. We can make true statements about the world in entirely physical terms. And so that's not a solution to the hard problem of consciousness. That's my response to you. Yeah, the counter. And it's an uphill climb. I recognize that. That's just the nature of the mind-body problem. Idealists, it just seems, you can't describe the world without making reference to mental terms. And it's like, well, no, the physicalists are just like, no, you can't make any mental claims without talking about possible motivation and desires and, certain physical respect. It's just one of those things. The intuitions just pull on each side, and different considerations are stronger than others here.
Yeah. So it's interesting that I might have forgotten what I said, but okay. So basically, that's interesting. Two responses I have to, I guess, that sort of issue. The first one I mentioned in my opening statement, but I won't get into that now. So I guess the more relevant response would be there is a distinction that idealists make between the external world and whatever it is that's non-mental, or at least this idea of a material world, right? So an idealist, I can accept that there is an external world. I accept that there is a world out there beyond my mentation. The question is whether or not we have to invent a category that is itself extra mental. Now, I admit that you will have to invent a category that is extra mental in the sense that it's beyond your mentation, right? That the world out there is beyond your mentation, right? So that avoids, that's a non-solipsist position, so I don't have to be a solipsist and say that everything's my mental mentation, right? But I have to say that, okay, yes, there is a world out there, and it is beyond my control, right? Now, the question is whether or not that requires me to posit a world that is beyond all mentation. And I would say, well, no, the external world is itself mentation. The world that we experience every day is that just is the real world, right? The world of experience, that just is what reality is. Like a color, sounds, taste, smells, those are real features of the world, right? Yes, it's external. Yeah, so it is a part of the external world, but it's still mental, right? So that's what I would say. And then I guess the second response, which is what I hinted at in the opening statement, which is, of course, the problem of the problem of positive properties, right? So I would say, I guess, that there is a sort of opposite problem for the non-idealists, which is that they have to say, if we say that physical objects are intrinsic to themselves, like there actually are intrinsic objects, physical non-mental objects, well, then we actually need to reference those things. We have to talk about matter without in reference to experience, right? And I don't think that's possible, right? So that's what I would say. I mean, I admit that for sake of clarity, that may not completely solve what you call the problem of matter, but I think the best way that idealists can respond to that is to just point that out, right? That when we talk about the external world, we are just talking about experience, regardless of whether or not that experience is experienced by our minds or experienced by some universal mind. So that's what I gotta say on that.
So we've got 5 minutes left. So I want to use the last 5 minutes to talk about something that we haven't talked about yet that I gave in my opening, and that's the prior probability of atheism and theism. So this is a controversial issue in the philosophy of religion. There is the simplicity of theism, and atheism does not have a happy history. So I argue tonight that atheism is simpler than theism because it posits fewer things and because the intrinsic probability of theism cannot be greater than 1/3. So what are your thoughts on the intrinsic probability of theism and the intrinsic probability of atheism? Do you have an opinion on that?
So
debate?
I'm actually working on a long video about that soon. And I will be arguing that either.
Great, I set you up. Plug it.
Okay. Yeah. So basically, there's a few things in response to that. So number one, I think it's important to recognize that in order for atheism to be a theory, we actually have to build a theory of atheism, right? So you're going to have to say stuff that's going to preclude theism, right? And if you do that, then it seems like they're going to be an equal footing, at least initially, right? That both atheism and theism are going to be an equal footing. Now, I know in the opening statement you did mention how I think it was theism requires supernaturalism, but atheism was compatible with supernaturalism, which it depends, right? So I don't like those terms. So if I'm going to evaluate that argument, I'm going to have to look at it in terms of idealism versus any sort of non-idealism, right? So I do agree. I admit that idealism is compatible with atheism, but I would say that there's other considerations to take into account. For example, you're going to have that arbitrary limits problem, where if you're an idealist but you're not a theist, well, then you're going to have to posit some fundamental bruteness to reality, and that doing that's going to be a theoretical cost, right, to the theory itself, and so that's going to decrease the prior probability. So I think, my opinion, I don't know if naturalism or theism is more intrinsically likely, at least if I look at it in that sense, right? Because when you build a theory, you have to preclude the other, right? But when you build the theory, you're going to have to say something, and that's going to decrease the probabilities. Unless you build a theory that doesn't preclude the other, but then if you do that, then you're not really putting a view on the table, right? So that's all I got to say. So basically, just one, we have to build theories, right? And when you do that, that's going to be a cost regardless of which side you are. And then number two, again, I just like to look at it in terms of idealism versus any sort of non-idealism, just because I don't like the terms natural and supernatural. I think those terms need to just go away. In my opinion, those are just really, really bad terms. So that's what I got to say in response. But again, I admit I don't have a full opinion on that yet. But yeah,
I will say that's not surprising because I think that the supernatural natural distinction here implies some form of dualism. There's this ontologically distinct supernatural realm and this ontologically distinct natural realm.
Mm-hmm.
So your response there doesn't surprise me at all. I know that we're probably short on time at this point, so I'll go ahead and I think we're moving to Q&A now.
Yeah, so I appreciate you guys with the conversation and just being very nice and charitable. So if you guys are good with it, I saved a little bit of time for closing remarks. So in case you were biting to say one last thing, I don't know if you guys want to just take a couple minutes and say if you have any last thoughts or anything before we go to Q&A.
Okay. We'll see how it goes with the Q&A. So
yeah, so I was gonna say there were a bunch of questions in the live chat as we were going, so we'll get through as many as we can. But if you want to make sure your questions asked, put it in now, because I can go back through the live chat, but getting to the questions now would be the best. If you do that, and then obviously because it's YouTube, if it's a super chat, we'll do that first. But closing remarks, does that sound good? Do you guys just do brief remarks?
Sounds good.
On the conversation?
I'll go first. I guess since I went first, I'll and I have those last two slides that recap what I went over tonight. So I'll just go over those.
Yeah, sure. All right. You should be shared there, Ben. Just take 5 minutes or so.
Sweet. Okay, so tonight, the thing that I really wanted to get through is that I think that the argument from consciousness can be formed in three broadly plausible ways. And so the first way was a likelihood way, the idea that consciousness is more likely given theism than atheism. So that's what I just take the typical argument from consciousness to be, that because we observe consciousness, that just raises the likelihood of theism to atheism. I think that there's a Bayesian formulation of this argument that is plausible. The idea that consciousness makes it probable that theism is true, or greater than at least 0.5. And then an abductive version of the argument from consciousness, the idea that theism is probably the best explanation of facts about consciousness, like the hard problem of consciousness. And so my objections to these three ways of approaching the argument from consciousness are: the first was that conscious experience does not favor either theism or atheism, because our existence as conscious observers induces an observation selection effect. So it biases what we're going to observe. So the probability of observing consciousness is 1, regardless of whether theism or atheism is true. The second objection was that there are particular observations about conscious experience that are more probable given atheism than theism. So this was my argument from physical minds. So I argued that there are facts from neuroscience, from genetics, and from morphology that raise the probability of atheism over theism. The third objection I had was targeted towards that Bayesian inference. So the Bayesian inference wants to argue that theism isn't more or atheism isn't more probable than theism, or even that theism is simpler than atheism. And I want to say that no, that's wrong. Atheism has a greater intrinsic probability than theism. And one of the reasons for thinking that is that the prior probability of theism cannot be greater than 1/3. So the idea that there's a perfectly benevolent, perfectly malevolent, and perfectly indifferent being are on equal footing. And so by the principle of indifference, their prior probability can't be greater than 1/3. And then my last objection is that theism cannot be the best explanation for the hard problem of consciousness, because neutral monism is. And it seems like we have resolved that disagreement. Neutral monism is the best solution to something like the hard problem of consciousness. But I wanted to argue that neutral monism is incompatible with theism. Theism has certain commitments that are just in far too much tension with something like neutral monism. Neutral monism implies that there isn't something like after death. We'd have to deny that there is a distinction between an ontological distinction between us and God. We'd have to deny that God created a world ontologically distinct from himself. And I think that these costs are just too much, and that it's much more plausible to think that theism implies some form of substance dualism. So that's my argument tonight. Again, those are my objections, I should say, to the argument from consciousness.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben. Kyle, do you have any kind of closing remarks here?
Yeah, I guess. Hold on. Let me share my screen real quick. Let's see here. Okay, here it is.
I don't think even professional debaters have like slides for like closing statements. So
no, I did it. I didn't really do.
Level.
I'm just So basically, just to recap, the argument from. Hold on. Yeah, this argument specifically. I think our main. So two things I think we would disagree on. Maybe more things, but I think Ben would actually agree with at least stage one. I think he would just say that neutral monism just follows from this. And I was going to mention other objections to neutral monism, which is the mentalism suspicion and the problem of experience, but we didn't have time for that, so that's okay. And of course, stage two, which is just the arbitrary limits thing. Again, we didn't really discuss this much. We were focused on what he mentioned earlier, which was just the disagreements about neutral monism, whether that's compatible with theism or not. So again, I just want to recap that I think our main disagreement is just more let's say, not as big as as I originally thought it would be. So that's pretty good about that. But yeah, I just want to just highlight again here that if you accept this argument right here, now I know some materialists might deny premise too, but I know Ben, you probably wouldn't. So, but yeah, I think either idealism would be true, or maybe some kind of neutral monism, and then of course just stage 2, which is. But I know Ben would probably reject stage 2 simply because of the fact that he doesn't think that idealism or neutral monism are compatible, or he doesn't think that monism in general is compatible with theism, which that's probably our biggest disagreement. But I mean, it is what it is. So, but yeah, I'm glad that Ben, I'm glad that we can at least agree to some extent that either idealism is true or neutral monism is true. So that's a really good. We're on the same page, basically. Like, it doesn't seem like we disagree on much when it comes to consciousness.
Team monism.
Wait, what? Yep, T-Bone. Yep.
Yeah, team monism.
To all the people who were hoping there was going to be two people screaming at each other for the last 90 minutes, I apologize. Not really. This is the way these debates really should go.
Yeah.
So what we're going to do now is we're going to do Q&A for about 15 minutes here. So get as many questions as we can. So we'll start here with John Buck, which says, it's for Ben. It says, I've heard you say, Ben, that you are a physicalist, a neutral monist, and an idealist. Can you lay out how you square these mutually exclusive positions with each other? So maybe just would you just say like you're a neutral monist? Like, what's your position with like philosophy of mind and such?
Absolutely. So I think this is a perfectly fair question because these terms and labels can be super confusing. So I'm a neutral monist in the sense that I believe that conscious experiences and personality are higher ordered biological functions like photosynthesis or digestion, but the only difference being that they have to appeal to this first person subjective experience. And so I think that mind and matter are two aspects of the same neutral substance. I'm a physicalist because I believe that there are truths that can be described in entirely physical terms. And by physical terms, I mean third person terms that include like matter and energy, charge, the basic standard model of physics. I think that that's a true part of reality. I think that that is a foundational aspect of reality, and that our complex conscious states are radically emergent from this underlying physical structure. That's entirely compatible with the view that some parts of reality will just have to be described in irreducibly subjective first-person terms. What it's like to be a bat is just not going to be able to be described in entirely physical terms. The term idealist in the philosophy of mind is the idea that the fundamental reality is mental, and that the material world is somehow illusory. I'm not an idealist in the philosophy of mind. I'm a neutral monist, like I just said. A physicalist in the sense that I'm a non-reductive physicalist. I don't think that you can reduce mind to matter. But I'm an idealist in an epistemological sense. So in epistemology, where we would talk about something like Kant's transcendental idealism, or Hegel's absolute idealism. I'm an idealist in Hegel's sense of an absolute idealist. And the basic idea here is that there is a identity between knowing and being. That not only are mind and matter two sides of the same coin, but also being and knowing are two sides of the same coin. And so that this does away with problems that arise in Kant's transcendental idealism, this idea of things in themselves, this aspect of reality that we just can't know. I want to do away with that in epistemology. I think Hegel largely has it right in his theme that knowing and being are two sides of the same coin, that in epistemology, that's the key. So that's how I square those, mutually exclusive sounding labels, because I certainly agree that there are senses in which, I could not be a physicalist and an idealist in a philosophy of mind sense. If we understand those terms exclusively in the philosophy of mind, it doesn't make any sense. So it's unfortunately the language games were established before I arrived on the scene, and this is the least misleading way to characterize my views, but even still, the least misleading way has these problems with it, unfortunately.
Thanks, Ben. A question here for Kyle, which says, to premise one of your argument preclude agent causation, how were God or agents an event?
Okay, yeah. So every event which has a cause, which is the same type. So, okay, I guess I should clarify. I think that agent causation is a subclass of just event causation, although I don't like to make that. I don't like to. So basically, this is the idea. So agent causation is obviously has to be caused by a conscious subject, right? That's what it means to be an agent. However, the causal closure that doesn't preclude agent causation, right? It just means that agent causation, whatever it is going to be a subclass of that sort of event causation or the causal closure causation, right? And I guess just causal closure just in general, in my mind, just simply means that just entails monism, right? So if you accept causal closure, then there can only be one type of causation, or at least things can only cause each other. The same substance can only cause itself in a certain way. So that's what I would say, that basically that ultimately agent causation is just going to be reduced to event causation. Now, again, I hold the libertarian free will, so I have to be a little careful when I say that. But I do think that when it comes to like free will and stuff, that it's going to be more of a compatibilist view. And I think Ben would take the same view of free will anyway. So that's good to know. But yeah, that's what I would
Thanks,
say.
Kyle.
Okay.
A question from monistic idealism for Ben. I think you mentioned this already before, Ben, but just to clarify, like, Ben, is the physical irreducible? If so, what makes the physical irreducible?
So I think that the physical is irreducible, so I don't think that we can use purely mental terms to describe the physical. So I can't appeal to mental qualities, what its likeness to have certain experiences in order to understand the conservation of momentum. The conservation of momentum is something that just does not make reference to any sort of mental qualities like that, and so it's irreducible in that sense. You can't cash out these physical truths in entirely mental terms.
A question here, I believe, for Kyle from Jono, which says, like, how does a little baby get their consciousness? Does it slowly emerge, or is there a moment where it pops into existence? What's God's role, if there is one?
Okay, yeah. So obviously, as an idealist, I would reject Craig's view, which is that just pops to existence. So I think their consciousness, so the subjective self, is there, right? It's just there automatically, right? But then this whole idea of what I call metaconsciousness or metacognition, that develops over time. So the baby's idea of, like, being themselves, right? So this idea of ego, obviously I agree that would evolve over time, that changes over time, that develops over time. That's what I would say. But the I, so the subjective consciousness itself is always there. So it's not like it just popped into existence from nowhere, right? It's always been there. So that's what I would say.
Yeah. A really hard question from Amir, which is Kyle's cat further evidence against monistic physicalism?
Yeah, I guess. Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
A question from John for Ben, which says, a very easy question here. What is the definition of naturalism, Ben?
So the way I understand metaphysical naturalism is the idea that there is no supernatural realm. So that's a cheap definition, because you have to first understand supernaturalism. And so I won't get off that easily. I also add the additional thesis that the universe is causally closed. So it's the idea that the conservation of energy holds throughout the entire universe. And so that there's nothing extra supernatural that is causally adding its energy to our net total energy. And so that if we were to observe the net total energy in the universe, that it would be constant and it would be zero. So I take that to be a sufficient understanding of naturalism, because I think that's entirely incompatible with theism, and I think it captures what is most plausible about naturalism.
Thanks, Ben. A question here for Kyle, again from John Buck. Probably have time for this, might be the last or maybe one more. It says, do subjects of experience come to exist as a type of like creation ex nihilo? If not, have I always existed? Like referring to like himself.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is interesting because different ideals have different answers to this question. So obviously, I don't accept creation ex nihilo, but that only refers to the context of when God created the universe, right? Now, when it comes to us as subjects, right? There's this weird idea, and it's gonna sound weird, but basically the idea is that we come to existence in the same way that dream characters do, right? Where you have this one mind, and then it's sort of like fragments, or I don't know. I'm going to try to avoid using those terms, but basically this idea of submergence, where you get the whole and then you have these parts, right? So we as individual subjects are the parts, right? We are kind of like the dream characters within God's mind, right? Now, I admit for clarity that I do not have a detailed, like, conceptual account of how that takes place. But it's not creation ex nihilo, so it's not the idea that, like, it just, God threw in a soul into a body or something like that. It's a little more complicated than that, right? So when we're talking about the creation of the I, of the self, I think it did it through a process of submergence, which is just the idea of getting the parts from a whole, or whole to its parts. So that's what I would say. And then that only applies to the I. And then when it comes to the ego itself, like the identity of the person, I think that evolves over time. So
awesome. Well, we are about at the end of our time. So Ben and Kyle, thank you so much for coming on. Their channels are linked down below. So Relay Theology is down there, and Christian Idealism. So I think everyone that listened appreciated this debate. I learned a lot just listening to you guys, and appreciate your charity and your intellect. So Ben, Kyle, thank you so much again for coming on and debating today. It was a lot of fun.
Yep.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And thank you everyone for tuning in. As always, we appreciate it. And if you're new here, always encourage you to subscribe, leave a like, all that fun stuff. If you enjoy the channel, you can become a YouTube member or become a patron. That always helps. But one last time, thank you guys. It's been a lot of fun. Wish everyone the best, and have a good one, guys.